My name is Gerald Feierstein. I'm a senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute. And we're pleased to welcome you to today's panel discussion examining the nexus between supporting the Palestinian refugees and regional stability. In particular, we want to explore how ensuring life-saving humanitarian aid, as well as the education and health programs, promotes security between Israelis and Palestinians, as well as security in neighboring countries. President Trump's recent announcement that the administration will cut funding to UNRWA over dissatisfaction with the Palestinian Authority's position on Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations has drawn international backlash from governments, NGOs, and human rights agencies. Beyond the program cuts, the administration has also restricted the geographic reach of UNRWA funding, denying assistance to programs in Lebanon and in Syria. This decision establishes for the first time in living memory a U.S. policy linking humanitarian assistance programs to bilateral policy disagreements. How will these funding cuts impact the work of UNRWA, and what does this say about the role of the United States in resolving the conflict? How are other countries and international organizations stepping in to fill the gap? What has been the impact on the ground in the aftermath of Trump's announcement? Here to delve into these questions, we have representatives from UNRWA, as well as other experts in the region. Scott Anderson, UNRWA's Director of Operations in the West Bank, will provide his insights into how UNRWA's operations have been affected on the ground. Scott directs UNRWA's West Bank programs, operations, and resources, including managing the agency's education system, health clinics, relief and social services, and microfinance initiatives for a population of more than 750,000 registered Palestinian refugees. Prior to his current position, Scott served as Deputy Director of Operations for UNRWA in the Gaza Strip. We're also honored to have with us today Elizabeth Campbell, the Director of UNRWA's Representative Office in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining UNRWA, Elizabeth was the Senior Humanitarian Policy Advisor in the Bureau of International Organizations, the Department of State, where she worked on refugee and humanitarian issues in the UN system. Hady Amr is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Insitution Center for Middle East Policy. Hady draws on 3 decades of experience related to the Middle East, including service as a key member of the U.S. negotiating team working on Arab economies, U.S.-Arab relations, and the entrepreneurship leadership of startups related to the Middle East. Also with us today is Jake Wallace. Jake is a non-resident senior fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, where he focuses on Israeli-Palestinian issues, Tunisia, and counterterrorism. During his more than 35 years tenure in the Foreign Service, Jake served as the U.S. Ambassador to Tunisia from 2012 to 2015, and as Consul General and Chief of Mission at the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem from 2005 to 2009. As Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, Jake was also a member of the U.S. Peace Process Team and intimately involved in funding decisions for Palestinian programs, including UNRWA. We're recording this discussion for posting on the MEI website. As such, so we ask that you silence your mobile devices, but we do encourage tweeting and ask that you use the hashtag MEIPalestine. Finally, I want to call attention to MEI's expansion campaign. UNRWA is not the only organization that needs money. This is our largest ever fundraising effort. We're renovating and expanding our traditional home around the corner on N Street so as to accommodate our rapidly growing activities and capabilities, including a new art gallery which will feature the work of Middle Eastern artists. Please pick up a pledge card at the front desk on your way out today if you haven't already, and consider giving your material support for MEI's growth. More information about the expansion is also available on our website, www.mei.edu, as well. Thank you again for coming, and please join me in welcoming our panelists. I thought the way we would do it is that we will do a round of comments from our panelists. I will ask a few questions to get things started. We'll have follow-up discussion afterwards, and then we want to leave plenty of time for all of you to be able to ask your own questions at the end. So Scott, let me begin with you as the person who's come farthest for this panel. If I could ask you to give a sense to the audience of the impact that the administration's decision is having on your programs on the ground.
So thank you, and thanks for having me here today. It's nice to see everybody this afternoon. I mean, I think what I'd like to talk about a bit is the risk of UNRWA being underfunded. This is perhaps an indicator that we have some challenges ahead, which we did before this announcement was made. But if you look across our entire operation, every day more than 500,000 children come to our schools. In the West Bank, 50,000 children come to our 95 schools every day, where they receive a very high quality education. The World Bank and others have published reports on the quality of the education. And we provide, in addition to math, reading, social sciences, we also teach human rights, conflict resolution, tolerance, and we have a very strong gender component to our education program as well as all of our services. And these kind of institutions that function well, I think are things we want to hold on to and keep functioning. Education is really the key to ensuring that there isn't dependence on aid moving forward, that it creates independent people who can be part of the global citizen network and fend quite well for themselves. So I think that in particular, education is the most important thing that we do. I had a refugee in Dheisheh camp explain to me, he said, as refugees, we don't have assets, so we invest in our children. And I think that summed up quite well the importance of education. And if you talk to the refugee community, they will tell you that education is the most important thing we do, and that's something I agree with. We also have a very strong health component where we treat a variety of things, including hypertension and diabetes, as well as providing food aid or food assistance to 100,000 people in the West Bank and over 1 million refugees in Gaza. So I think that if you look at all this holistically, what's at risk is potentially the erosion of, I guess, secular civilian institutions in the Middle East that function quite well, where children receive an excellent education that instills them with a value system to help them succeed globally when they leave our care and matriculate to secondary and tertiary education. And it's something I think that we should work very hard to hold on to. And if UNRWA is not funded, that's what's at risk of happening, that we no longer provide the education, the health care to the community, and things start to backslide. And it takes far longer to recover than it does to slide back. So we hope that we can convince everyone to continue funding us so we remain as we are and continue to improve and move forward. Thank you.
Can I ask also, to a certain extent, the strong historic U.S. support for UNRWA, and we are by far, I think, the largest donor for UNRWA over the 60 plus years of its existence. To what extent do you think that the U.S. contribution to UNRWA, in a sense, gives credibility to the U.S. as an honest broker in the peace process? And how does this decision by the Trump administration affect the way Palestinians perceive the United States and the role of the United States in the future of the peace process?
Sure, thank you. I guess I would start by saying, we are very grateful to the U.S. We've had a very long, productive partnership between UNRWA and the United States, going back to President Truman and now forward to President Trump. And as he said, the U.S. is by far the single largest donor, and even bigger than many multilateral donors that we have. And I think that what that does highlight is the importance that the U.S. places on the region from a foreign policy perspective. And they are trying to be honest brokers in the peace process. I think that what I've seen in the West Bank on the ground, and I can't really speak to the impact on the peace process, that's a little beyond my remit perhaps. But what I can say is that, as you mentioned, I'm American. I was in the military before I joined the UN. And that's not necessarily viewed positively right now on the ground in the West Bank, is how I would say it. There's indications of potentially growing anti-American sentiment around this. And it's certainly something that we have to watch closely, but again, without speaking to how this impacts the larger geopolitical challenges, the credibility of the U.S. did take a hit with this decision.
Right. I think we're all aware of an incident in Bethlehem just a few days
Correct.
ago where a group of Americans on a completely unrelated visit were asked to leave the hall. So,
Correct.
yeah. Jake, if I can ask you, based on your own experience and your many years, I didn't mention, of course, that prior to your service as Consul General, you were also Deputy Principal Officer in Jerusalem for a number of years. Yes, you were my predecessor, actually, yes. But can I ask you what, from your own experience and from your own time there, what was the relationship with UNRWA, and how did you perceive UNRWA as a partner for us in the West Bank?
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks, Jerry, for inviting me, and it's great to be here at MEI. As you said, I worked for more than 35 years in the State Department. I worked for 6 different administrations, 3 of them Democrats, 3 of them Republicans. And there was, I would say, a range of views over that period by the different administrations about UNRWA, but there was one thing that I think all of them understood and all of them shared, which was they put a value on the role that UNRWA played in stabilizing the situation on the ground. I'm most familiar with West Bank and Gaza, but I think it's also true about the other areas where UNRWA operates, in Syria, in Jordan, and in Lebanon. In all those areas, UNRWA is a big contributor to the stability. As my colleague was saying, UNRWA basically does 3 things. It provides education for refugees, it provides health care, and it provides social services, food, and other basic assistance. And in all of the areas where UNRWA operates, you have a host government, whether it's the Palestinian Authority or the governments in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, that have very limited capabilities to begin with, are already very highly dependent on foreign assistance. So none of them are in a position to step in to replace UNRWA if UNRWA to stop providing these services. And it's not hard to imagine the kind of instability that could result from having those services removed from that population. Gaza, I think, is actually the starkest example of this, even more so than the West Bank. In Gaza, and correct me if I get the numbers wrong, you've got a population of about 2 million Palestinians. Roughly a third of them live in refugee camps. Roughly a third of them are refugees, but they live outside of the camps. And then the other third are non-refugees. So you've got a very large population that are refugees and are very dependent on UNRWA services. The other thing the other point I want to make about UNRWA and the role it plays in stability is UNRWA at times of crisis. And I can give you a good example from my time when I was Consul General, which was the first war in Gaza in December 2008 and January 2009. At the time, in addition to the military conflict that was going on, there was a grave concern about humanitarian conditions in Gaza. And there was a large international response to that, including a variety of UN agencies, including UNRWA, but also UNDP, UNHCR, the ICRC, the bilateral donors, including the US and the Europeans. But UNRWA was the critical factor in that, just simply because UNRWA has such a large presence in a place like Gaza. UNRWA has the trucks to move supplies around. UNRWA has the drivers. UNRWA has the people that know how to move goods across that border, dealing with both the Israelis and Hamas and the other Palestinian Authority officials. So we worked very closely with UNRWA in that period as well, and relied on them not only to move the humanitarian goods, but also to keep us informed on conditions in Gaza, what was going on, both humanitarian, but just simply life conditions for people on the ground. Generally, I'd say the relationship we had with UNRWA was always quite good. As has been pointed out, the United States is UNRWA's largest single contributor. Americans have always played senior management roles in UNRWA. We work very closely with them. And I found even when we had issues about, say, curriculum in schools was one example where we had issues with UNRWA. UNRWA was responsive to that. UNRWA was very interested in working together. It was very much a partnership. We understood the critical role UNRWA played, and UNRWA, of course, understood the critical role the donors played in making sure they can continue to operate.
Yeah. You had mentioned a little bit about the ability of UNRWA to work on both sides of the border and to work with Israeli officials as well as with the Palestinian, the PA, and Palestinian population and the donors. If I can come back to the issue of the government of Israel and where they are on these issues, can you talk a little bit about your own engagement and your own understanding, particularly in terms of where the Israeli security establishment is, because in many ways they are most sensitive to the situation on the ground in the Palestinian territories?
Sure. I think there's always been a division in Israel, or a range of views in Israel about UNRWA. On the one hand, you've got politicians, particularly on the right, that are very critical of UNRWA, not just in terms of how it operates, but simply the existence of UNRWA, that they see it as perpetuating the cause of Palestinian refugees, of enshrining the right of return. So there's certainly on the political right in Israel a good bit of animosity towards UNRWA. On the other hand, as you pointed out, Jerry, the defense establishment, the army, the civil administration, and the Israeli security forces, who deal directly with the Palestinian population, particularly in the West Bank, but also to a degree in Gaza, have an understanding of the role that UNRWA plays in maintaining stability. And that's what's, I think, most critical to them. They don't take a view about the politics of things. They simply are dealing with the fact that in a place like Gaza, where you have such a large refugee population that's so dependent on an organization like UNRWA, and no other organization that can step in and fill that void if UNRWA were to go away, they understand that, and they are willing to work with UNRWA on a practical level. That's how UNRWA is able to move goods in and out of Gaza, whether it's a crisis or whether it's just simply day-to-day activities. The Israeli authorities that control that border, understand the need to move the food in, move the equipment in that UNRWA needs to operate. I remember in one of my earlier tours, which was in our embassy in Tel Aviv, where I was working on economic programs in Gaza. This was during the first Intifada. I also used to deal with the Israeli civil administration at the time as the liaison on these issues. And I dealt with an Israeli general who, I won't mention his name, but who had risen very high in the Israeli army ranks. And he always talked to me about the importance of making sure that the Palestinians didn't lose hope and that they had a stake in the situation. In other words, that the situation that Israel feared the most was the Palestinians felt they had nothing to lose. He would tell me that if a Palestinian has a job, if his family is dependent on that job, he's not going to want to do anything which would put that at risk and put the livelihood of his family at risk. So he was always looking for ways to make sure that the population was engaged, make sure that the population got services like education, health care, food when they needed it. So that's sort of the mindset of the Israeli military. But as I said, there's a very different mindset among the political leadership in Israel, and we saw that in the reaction to the U.S. administration's most recent decision.
Right. Thanks, Jake. Hadi, if I can pick up on a comment that Jake made, which is not only the impact of the administration's position on refugee populations in West Bank and Gaza, but more broadly in the region. I wonder if I could ask you to comment about how you see the effect in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria with large refugee populations.
Sure. Thanks, Ambassador. Thanks for having me, and thanks to MEI. And it's great to be on this panel with so many friends, old and new, and with actually a very distinguished audience. I see so many people in the audience that know these issues very well. Look, I think I'd like to come at it from two fronts. So on the one hand, you know, as I understand it, my UNRWA colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, 80% of UNRWA beneficiaries actually live outside of areas under Palestinian Authority control. So in a sense, the U.S. decision is a very blunt instrument, very kind of, you know, in doing that, you know, again, I'm saying, you know, Palestinian Authority is not in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority is not in Jordan, the Palestinian Authority is not in Lebanon. So it's a very indirect and blunt instrument to get at this. Look, I mean, absolutely, refugees in the West Bank and Gaza and Lebanon and Jordan all depend on UNRWA services day in and day out, education, healthcare. From my perspective, having sat in government, we saw UNRWA as a tremendous partner, efficient, delivering core and necessary services, responsive to our concerns throughout. And so from a U.S. government perspective, UNRWA was, you know, absolutely a tremendous partner for us. And I think there's a reason that, you know, every American president since its founding has given considerable funding to UNRWA. UNRWA is are the good guys here, right? We might get, as Americans, we might get frustrated with the Palestinians. At times, we might get frustrated with the Israelis at times. But UNRWA are the good guys. They're providing basic services, health and education, to people who need it the most. It's for that reason that we have given, and they also align with our core American values. When you look down the UNRWA contribution sheet, about halfway down the list, you actually see a line item of donations from American citizens, right? That's above and beyond the money the U.S. government gives. So U.S. citizens contribute, to this sort of important charitable cause because it aligns with our core values and our national security. And I think, you know, for those reasons, it's trying to achieve changes in the PLO or the Palestinian Authority's political decision-making through the use of UNRWA is, I think, really misguided, and it sort of damages not only our core national security interests, but the national security interests of our key allies in the region, Jordan, Lebanon, and dare I say, also Israel. And I'll build on what Jake said, which is that, I mean, I got panic calls from, you know, people in the Israeli military late last year saying they're not really going to do this, are they? You know, because the Israeli military knows that UNRWA provides key stabilizing services that provide healthcare and education and hope and prosperity for the most down and out members of society in the Middle East, and those are refugees, and in this case, Palestinian refugees.
Thanks, Hadi. And if I can ask you a very specific question, and that is on Lebanon.
Sure.
And Lebanon, in many ways, especially vulnerable to tensions with Palestinian refugees. I mean, I think that everybody in the room is aware of the history of Palestinians in Lebanon. The Lebanese are heading for an election in a few months. If the support for the Lebanese refugee population goes down in Lebanon, and as I mentioned earlier, I mean, we have been informed that, in fact, the administration's position zeroes out assistance for refugee programs in Lebanon. Should we be concerned that this is going to contribute negatively to a rise in sectarian tensions in Lebanon, and could that affect not only the stability of Lebanon, but also the outcome of the election?
UNRWA services in Lebanon are absolutely vital, in my opinion. Again, we give foreign assistance to Lebanon. We see Lebanon as a key ally. Cutting aid to diminishing UNRWA's programming in Lebanon sort of runs counter to all the work and all that the United States has been doing to strengthen that, the Lebanese state and national security. So absolutely, could it impact the upcoming Lebanese elections? Absolutely. Could it lead to further instability? Absolutely. Lebanon is already a country that hosts, millions of refugees, a tiny country that hosts, enormous numbers of refugees. And it's, absolutely, it could really be destabilizing there.
Okay. Thanks, Hadi. And so let me turn to you, Elizabeth, and ask you to tell us how you're going to fix all this. Can you, if you could talk a little bit about the thinking in New York and also about your own engagement with the administration?
Thanks. So let me just begin by saying that my boss, the Commissioner General, was here in Washington in late November, and he had meetings at the highest level with all parts of the U.S. administration who engages on UNRWA, including also members of Congress. And those meetings were positive. He received good feedback, supportive feedback, reassurance at the highest level that UNRWA is a public good, doing good work across the region. We continued our ongoing relationship with the administration through late December, and it was really a shock to all of us that there was some kind of challenge with the impending funding that we were expecting in early January. We were never informed of any particular reason. We haven't received any details about any particular problem or a rationale or anything that we would have to do to secure additional funding. So it was really a very abrupt and unexpected shift in policy and thinking, and we still don't have a lot of details around some of the reasons why we ended up with what is a partial contribution than what we had been anticipating. Last year, the U.S. government provided UNRWA about $360 million. So we had expected, roughly, more, give or take, about half of that, and we did receive $60 million. And as Jerry noted, it came for the first time in the history of the U.S. engagement with UNRWA with geographical restrictions. And again, that hasn't been explained to us, so I'm sure there is a rationale for that, but we're not privy to the thinking behind it. So it is indeed the largest financial crisis the agency has ever faced. It's not one for which we were able to easily prepare. It is the goal of the Commissioner General to keep these services open. And the reason is that you can all appreciate, just by looking at institutions in our own country here in the United States, that once any type of institution, a school, a hospital, a clinic, starts to erode or decline, bringing that back is a very difficult, arduous, expensive, fraught process. He's very committed to keeping services open. That is his mandate, and he takes that very seriously. So we have been working very hard. He in particular, he's traveled to multiple capitals across Asia and Europe just over the past 4 or 5 weeks, sounding the alarm bells of what's at stake. We're very committed to securing new donors, additional resources from existing donors. We've also began a wide variety of conversations with development actors, including the World Bank, in an attempt to sort of broaden the kinds of relationships that we have. So resource mobilization generally is very important for us. Something to know, though, about UNRWA, we are so unique in the UN family. We are fundamentally operational. The overwhelming majority of our staff are Palestine refugees. There are very few people who actually do the resource mobilization. It's not an excuse, but it speaks to the fact that the beneficiaries are the workforce are the refugees themselves. The beneficiaries and the services all go to refugees. So it's something that it's going to be a long, hard hill to climb up. We obviously welcome engagement with the U.S. administration to try to figure out ways that we can move forward together. As Scott said, we've had a long and trusted partnership. That partnership or that engagement is what has enabled the U.S. administration across several decades to ensure that their values and objectives are indeed reflected in our work, and we hope that the U.S. administration continues to see engagement as the best way forward.
You mentioned a long, hard hill. So let me ask about a long, hard hill, and a particular one, Capitol Hill. And is there engagement with the Congress? And what kind of feedback are you getting from the various members of Congress?
Sure. I was just telling Hadi that I was there, I think, the day after we heard what was happening in the administration. And again, here too, in the same way that UNRWA has enjoyed support from Democratic and Republican administrations for several decades, we have also enjoyed bipartisan support on the Hill. You know, let's be honest, it's not always the issue on which every member of Congress wishes to hang his or her hat, but nevertheless, for all of the reasons the panelists suggested, when push comes to shove, the funding support is always there. So I think I don't have a very easy way to answer your question, in part because you know, I think some of the feedback that we are getting also from members of Congress is part of sort of a bigger approach and a potential shift that the administration may be considering in terms of the way in which it allocates foreign assistance. Something that has become quite apparent in the decision about UNRWA is the confluence between humanitarian assistance and other forms of foreign aid. This is something that's very new. I think that members of Congress are deeply concerned about this. You've seen that articulated in a variety of public letters onto which very prominent international humanitarian organizations and religious groups have recently signed. There's a letter circulating in the House onto which now 100 members have signed, calling for the restoration of funding to UNRWA. It's important that you know, we continue to talk about what's at stake, as Scott began saying. But I think UNRWA is part of a bigger story that's emerging about the provision of U.S. foreign assistance generally and the conditions under which that is going to be made available, and what it now means to be looking at it as sort of a single stream of funding where humanitarian assistance, which has been provided by the U.S. government very generously over several decades, has been intended only to respond to the needs of civilians and not to achieve political objectives. We now see that that is no longer perhaps a policy that the current administration will seek to continue. All of this to say, I think members of Congress are also grappling with some of these seemingly new shifts.
And if I could, you mentioned in passing one other point, which I think is quite important, and I'm not sure that everybody has actually understood this, and that is the discussion about the funding cut has more or less been with the idea the level of support was cut by 50% from the original administration request of $125 million, which was in fact itself a cut from previous levels of baseline support for UNRWA. But in any event, that the administration had requested 125 and it cut to 60. But in fact, if you look at the FY17 actual funding, it was closer to $350 million, including several special allocations for refugees in Syria and for some other important programs that went beyond the baseline support. What is your understanding about the willingness of the administration to continue to fund those kinds of special projects?
I mean, right now we haven't received any type of coherent engagement that would lead us to an understanding of where they are. I mean, I think it's an ongoing conversation. What we can only do at this time is to articulate the risks, the needs, and the very serious impact that it's having in terms of security for our own staff. So I don't really know the answer to that question, but obviously we are actively engaged in a wide variety of contingency planning, and have looked at the initial contribution as possibly the only contribution that we may get this year.
Okay. Let me throw a question out to the panel, and that is, we had the Palestinian Authority representative here a couple of weeks ago, Ambassador Zumwalt, who spoke very powerfully on a number of issues that we're confronting these days in terms of the U.S.-Palestinian relationship, how we see the peace process going forward. And at one point, Ambassador Zumwalt made the argument that, in fact, the issue with UNRWA is not a funding issue, but is, in fact, a fundamental view on the part of the administration that, in fact, the Palestinian refugees are no different from any other refugees, no different from Afghans or Syrians or anybody else, and therefore, why are they not part of UNHCR? I was on the Hill a couple of weeks ago talking to a staffer up there who made a similar kind. He wasn't advocating for that approach, but he was certainly articulating it. You mentioned, Jake, that there are certainly some of the political leadership in the State of Israel who would believe that and would see that in some way by removing UNRWA, folding it into the larger UNHCR refugee population, in fact, it would take the refugee issue off the table as part of a final status issue in an Israeli-Palestinian negotiation. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of conflating of two different things here. One is the political issue of Palestinian refugees and how that gets resolved in a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians, and services that are provided to the existing population of refugees, which is what UNRWA is doing. And there's a tendency, particularly in Israel, to mix up these two things, and this may be influencing the administration as well, to see UNRWA as sort of the way to solve this political problem. As the president said in the case of Jerusalem, he was taking that issue off the table, that there may be some tendency here to try to do the same thing with the refugee issue. The problem with that is it doesn't, just by simply shifting these services from UNRWA to UNHCR or some other organization, doesn't change the political issue. The original refugees and their descendants believe that they're entitled to some right of return. And the only way to address that is through a negotiated process, which is what we've been trying for decades now to do. And the refugee issue has been obviously one of the most difficult of those issues. If you made UNRWA go away tomorrow, and if you somehow provided the services to the people, you would still have a large population of Palestinians that claim this right, and you would have to address that in some way. And I don't think it's realistic for certain Israeli politicians, or possibly for this administration, to think that they can make this issue go away simply by cutting funding for UNRWA. And again, even if that's your goal, destabilizing the situation on the ground now by cutting UNRWA, depriving Palestinian refugees of existing services like education and health and food, is certainly not going to contribute to a resolution of the Palestinian refugee issue. If anything, it's going to make it worse and harder to achieve that outcome.
Hadi?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Jake just said, and I would also, say that it actually could have a counter purpose, serve in the opposite direction, which is, Palestinian refugees don't derive their sense of a right of return from UNRWA. They derive it from their own sense of history, and they articulate it through international law. And UNRWA was sort of created out of that. So actually, I would argue, not that the president would listen to me, but I would argue, if he were, that actually cutting services actually kind of instigates raises the refugee issue higher up on both the international arena sort of agenda, and with the refugees themselves, saying, you know, this situation is unacceptable, therefore it's even more imperative that we, you know, have a solution for it. So I just see it working. It's like a triple loss. It's a multiple loss. So it not only those two things, but it also, again, it destabilizes the situation on the ground for our allies. So I think you're right. Just like with Jerusalem, I think Trump in Jerusalem said, oh, I'm going to take Jerusalem off the table by saying we're going to move our embassy there. In my opinion, what he did was he took away the table. You know, he kind of broke the negotiating table, but he didn't take, and left Jerusalem kind of splattered all over the floor. He didn't take Jerusalem, so he broke the table. And I think there's a danger of doing the same thing with UNRWA, and I think that would just be an even bigger catastrophe, because UNRWA is a major institution that provides services, and as was said, when institutions are decimated, it takes years to rebuild them, and there'll be a real day-in, day-out cost to millions of the most vulnerable people in the region, which will then become susceptible to other forces.
Okay. Thank you. And Elizabeth and Scott, you touched on also this issue that, you know, one of the explanations that the administration has given for their decision to cut funding was the need for reforms, quote unquote, of UNRWA. And Jake touched on one issue that was a long-standing one, certainly when he and I were out there in the 90s, which was the curriculum issue, the question about whether or not the UNRWA curriculum, the school books reflected the reality of the situation on the ground and the recognition of Israel as a sovereign state, et cetera, et cetera. Have you engaged with the administration? Has the administration reached out in any way to try to raise what concerns they might have and what reforms they might seek? Have there been any discussions about that?
We read a lot about it in the press. I mean, maybe some of it is true. We don't know, but we haven't officially been informed of any particular requests. We know that this word reform is sort of buzzing around, but it could mean many kinds of things to many different types of people, from political to technical, but we have not been, no one has communicated to us anything about potential reforms that the U.S. administration may be asking of us.
Okay. And UNRWA was created by a UN General Assembly mandate in 1948. Is there any discussion about looking at that mandate again, of revising it, or maybe reinforcing it?
So again, it's not a conversation that we have had at all with the U.S. administration. It's not a conversation that they've tried to ask us about. Again, we see sometimes in the press references to this. Again, you know, UNRWA is a product of the member states of the General Assembly, right? We didn't create our own mandate, nor do we have any ability to change it. So if sovereign nations, member states of the UN, decide they want to make changes, that is their prerogative, of course, to do so. But I'm not aware that there's any serious conversations taking place in New York about that at this time.
Okay. So Scott, you're going to go back to the West Bank soon.
I am, yes.
and for right now, the plan is to move ahead and continue doing your programs and see where things might turn out.
No, certainly. I mean, we I think Elizabeth mentioned, and I may have earlier, our services remain functional. We're implementing our mandate. It's something that we all take as the leadership of the organization very seriously, and we'll continue to try and move forward. You know, if I could, I'd just like to add just a bit about reforms. I started with UNRWA in 2008, and I've been there almost continuously since. And I can say with great certainty, a year has not passed that we haven't talked about reform. We've reformed how we do education, which led to the achievements that I talked about that we're doing so well. We reformed healthcare in our approach in a way that lowered the antibiotic prescription rate, so it saved us money. And in 2016, we moved from food to cash in the West Bank. So you have less on the back end, and you give people more dignity and choice. I mean, fundamentally, we are a taxpayer-funded organization, not just from the U.S., but from everybody. And you know, with that comes a responsibility to be as efficient and effective as possible with the resources you're given. And I think that we have done that, certainly in the 10 years that I've been there. And we are better for that. And it's something we will continue to try to do, is to make ourselves better, because at the end of the day, the better the service we provide to the refugee community, the better it is for everyone.
Okay, thanks. Let's go ahead and open up to the audience. We have a microphone circulating. When we call on you, please stand up and say your name and organization. We'll start with this gentleman over here in the blue shirt.
Hi, my name is Blake Selzer. I've worked with CARE International. I was in Jordan for the last 3 years. First, I want to thank MEI for hosting this and the panelists for taking the time. Looking at the issue today, actually, everyone has talked about the high dependency on, first a comment, then a quick question, but the high dependency on foreign assistance and the critical role UNRWA plays, which I completely agree with. I do find it interesting that the word occupation didn't even come up by anyone today, actually, in this panel. So it just has food for thought. And I know that can be a whole nother panel discussion. But my question is, in light of potential cuts by the US, what do you see as potentially other nations and or entities to fill that gap? Because you mentioned the effect of cuts on the ground, but also for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, which I think are two completely separate issues. I'm not sure about the honest broker. But so what do you see? Do you see other nations and regions stepping up, or NGOs like my own, and just have your thoughts on that, and whether how much you need, are others stepping up, like the EU or the Gulf or others? That's my question. Thanks.
I'll start if you want. So I mean, first maybe to state that UNRWA started the year with a deficit programmatically, right, as we often have. Because we provide the type of services that we do, we can't just stop as some other entities do that provide aid around the world. We remain committed to providing all those services. And part of that is remaining committed to always identifying new streams of income. We work quite hard to bring new member states in. For example, last year Russia joined as a formal donor, signed a multi-year agreement. And we've got a number of other countries to sign multi-year agreements. So what that does is give us predictable streams of income, and it allows us to plan better for our workforce in the out years. I think that if you just look at the scale of what we do, I don't know that there's another organization that can step in and pick it up. It's just not possible. We're at our core 31,000 people across 5 countries, or 4 countries, pardon me. That's not easy for anybody to just walk in and pick up. Similarly, if because of the way our salaries are structured with our staff, we're very cost efficient in the delivery of services. For another UN entity to pick up their salary scale structure is much differently. It would be more expensive for fundamentally the same intervention that we're providing in a very efficient, effective way at this moment in time. Elizabeth, you want to add?
That Scott's right. I mean, it's not as if UNRWA was, just rolling in cash at the beginning of the year. We would have had a huge challenge, nevertheless. But I would say that the uncertainty about continued U.S. funding has created a lot of difficulties for us to secure additional donations from current donors and new donors, because they too are looking at the situation, wondering, is this it? Will there be more? Not sure what the U.S. position, where it will land. And so we are experiencing a lot of wait and see, which obviously is not helpful in our resource mobilization efforts.
Yes. Hi. Microphone's coming.
Hi, Deborah Shushan from Americans for Peace Now. So first I want to put my cards on the table and say that my organization is very supportive of UNRWA. I've been in touch with members of Congress about the letter that Elizabeth referenced earlier, strongly in support of it. Having said that, though, because I sense that within this, certainly on the panel and probably within this room, there are a lot of UNRWA supporters here, again, myself one of them, but I wanted to play devil's advocate, if I could. You certainly hear, even though there's been bipartisan support on the Hill from UNRWA, there's also, on the right side of the aisle, certainly a lot of criticism as well. And so I'm wondering if you could address the question of why, at least over time, UNRWA's services couldn't be shifted to UNHCR, why there should be an agency that is dedicated specifically to Palestinian refugees. On the, again, the sort of critique on the right, if you could also address the question of incitement, cooperation, or alleged incitement, cooperation with Hamas, those criticisms on that side. And then a devil's advocate question on the other side. And that would be, there are those who say that UNRWA relieves the responsibility of Israel as, to use the word occupation that we just heard, as the occupying power to provide some of these services that it would need to provide if UNRWA wasn't there. What do you say to that? Shouldn't Israel have to do that? Is UNRWA relieving some of that burden? Thanks. Love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. So, it's funny. Before this position, when I was working in the State Department with the UN, we used to always say the UN's not an entity; it's controlled by member states. But that's true. UNRWA is at the same time an independent entity, but we are a creation of the member states. So we have no decision-making authority in whether we become part of UNHCR, don't become. That is up to member states. So that is a discussion that they can have in New York, and they can decide how they want to move forward. But I will say that,
you presumably have a personal opinion about it, right?
Do I have a personal opinion about it? No.
You're not here to make that.
Yeah. No. So, look, I mean, to answer some of the critiques that we hear on a regular basis as well, okay, one of them is the idea that refugees who, for which UNHCR is responsible, you don't get derivative or generational status. That is not true. If you're an Afghan who is displaced in the 70s, your children and your children's children are also considered refugees by UNHCR. If you're a Somali living in Dadaab refugee camp since the 90s, your children and your children's children also are registered by the agency and are eligible for assistance. So in that sense, there is no differences. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I think some make that argument. So there is no differences in that regard. The second piece I would say is that as Scott said, we directly implement all of our services. That is not the case for UNHCR. They directly implement almost nothing. They subcontract good organizations like CARE and others to do their work. So theoretically speaking, if UNHCR were to absorb UNRWA's services, it would cost much, much, much more, not least because they would be required to pay the same staff that we currently pay at much higher rates, according to UN rules and regulations. So it would be much more costly because of the contractual relationship with their implementing partners, but also because of the pay scale. Scott, I think, was saying that a driver who works for the UN is paid the same as a doctor who works for UNRWA. So it's quite a differential from a donor perspective. And then the third piece that critics often argue or reach the conclusion that it should be absorbed by UNHCR relates to this durable solution issue, right? The idea that UNHCR, through its convention, is able to provide lawful, durable solutions, either through voluntary return, local integration into the countries into which they fled, or third country resettlement. It is true that those solutions are what UNHCR pursues. Its top solution it pursues is voluntary repatriation. That is the #1 goal for the agency, to have refugees return voluntarily in safety and dignity to their original homes. That's what UNHCR works on. It does do some third country resettlement. Globally, about 1% of refugees globally benefit from that. And as you may be aware, that's an avenue that has closed, or there's fewer slots available globally for that, including here in the US, and there has been in the past. So those are some of the areas that we most often hear that, and some of the reasons why I think there's some confusion about that. Scott.
I get the easy one with Hamas. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. So when Hamas came into power, the UN had put into place a no-contact policy. And I can say that we strictly implemented that while I was in Gaza. But it did leave or carve out a little bit of a loophole that you could have previously existing technical relationships could be continued. And an example I'd give of that is if there was an outbreak of mumps in Khan Yunis when I was there, you have to have some discussion with the Ministry of Health. You can't do stuff like that in a vacuum. And similarly, we made sure that we were not giving food assistance somebody the Ministry of Social Affairs, or now Social Development, was giving. So those kind of relationships continued, but that was it. And we didn't have any, and don't have any cooperation beyond that with Hamas at the moment. The other thing, the last one I think you addressed was, does this relieve Israel of their responsibility? I mean, I think you could argue that a bunch of different directions, but what to me it comes back to is our mandate from the General Assembly says this is what we do, so that's what we do. We provide the services, and we make sure we provide them the best way that we can, and we will continue to implement our mandate. That's why we're here.
Jake, Hadi, did you want to add anything about why not just stick the Israelis with the bill?
I'll try. I guess what I'd say to that is, to people who think that is, there was a time before the PA existed that Israel did provide those services. There was a civil administration run by the Israeli Ministry of Defense that governed the West Bank and Gaza. And they ran the schools, they ran the hospitals, not for the refugees, but for the non-refugee population. And Palestinians uniformly did not like that. They complained about the quality of the education, they complained about the quality of the hospitals, they complained about the political bias and how Israel implemented programs for its own benefit. I don't think it makes any sense to try to return to that previous situation, which was not satisfying to anybody. The current situation where you have the Palestinian Authority providing those roles for non-refugees also is not an ideal situation. And there's a lot of criticism among Palestinians of the authority as well. I think the way you address that problem and the refugee population more broadly is through a peace agreement and a two-state solution where you have a Palestinian government that is sovereign and is able to control the territory that it governs, and they provide the services. That's I think the objective that we've all been working toward, and that's where we should go with this, not try to go back to some previous situation that didn't satisfy anybody either.
I agree with Jake, so I'll just yield the time to another question.
And we should make the point, of course, that part of the question applies only to refugees in Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. It has nothing to do with refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, or Syria. Paul?
Thank you. Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute. There was mention of the Israeli military establishment and their maybe position on the issue. My question, and maybe this is to you, Ms. Campbell, if the DoD, Department of Defense, which has a lot of influence with the administration and maybe on Congress, has weighed in, or have you had any contacts with them or them with you, given that, as the panel was put together, it's an issue of stability in various parts, and I think it also links to the counterterrorism effort. The refugee camps in Lebanon were places where terrorist groups try to recruit. That could apply to Jordan as well, and I would worry if aid was suspended, particularly from the Lebanese camps, but also in Jordan, that would awaken terrorist groups that this is a group we could try to recruit. So my question is, the DoD, whether it's General Mattis' office or CENTCOM and General Votel, have they weighed in on any of this?
Yeah, thank you. They have, of course, and there are ongoing interagency discussions about UNRWA in which DoD is involved, and I have met with them. And I think what you suggest is right. They, similar to how most of the Israeli Defense Forces feel, understand the importance not just in the West Bank and Gaza, but particularly in these other areas. Where they see the regional piece, right? The Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, all of those pieces. So they absolutely are weighing in, and I think that they would weigh in a way in which you, like they have been weighing in a way in which you suggested. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Hi, thank you. My name is Moritz Lüttgerath from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I also want to take up the role of the devil's advocate. First of all, I would, as you have multiple times stated that you're pretty much just enacting the mandate of sovereign nations, so you can't comment on the way UNRWA acts or executes its mandate, or the way or the mandate it has. But at the same time, you have implicitly or explicitly also criticized the decision of a sovereign nation. So I would like to ask you for your take and your opinion on the following question, namely, taxpayers in the US might want to ask why you, what the success of the funding to UNRWA has been. You have made a strong case for the stability, but they would also maybe want to know what is the way forward, yeah? Because trying to maintain a situation of stability and might not be satisfactory in the long run. So how do you view that criticism? How do you respond to that criticism? How do you see your ability, or where could you do more in alleviating the necessity of Palestinian refugees in receiving the funding from UNRWA? And my second question is on a more concrete aspect. On January 31st, the AHLC had its meeting in Brussels. Were there any concrete financial commitments made to additional funding to UNRWA? Thank you.
Say a couple of things. So what I wanted to say about your first question is that as a long-time humanitarian I've worked in various places where normally sort of a typical humanitarian operation is about providing very sort of basic necessities. Plastic sheeting, food, it's very short term. It's always, the idea always is that's just enough to keep a person or a family alive until a solution is found. It's not, frankly, I mean, a very satisfactory approach when we also know that these people across the world, so I'm not just speaking of Palestinian refugees, are living in protracted situations for an average of 15 or 20 years, right? At UNRWA, what is really the amazing thing about the organization is that it's not just about keeping people alive, it's actually about giving people tools, as Scott said earlier, to be less dependent and more independent. And you will meet Palestinians, including the ambassador to whom you earlier referred, all over the world, including in this country, who had an UNRWA education. And education in and of itself is not a political solution, but it's a very powerful tool that allows individuals to be empowered and to find ways out of what I think you sort of described as maybe a cycle of dependency or something like that. And then Scott can speak more to that, but just on the AHLC, what we know for sure is that many donors who currently support UNRWA at our request and given the general situation, agreed to front load the contributions they were already planning to make, which we appreciate very much and has been very helpful, but we are not aware of additional financial contributions that came out of that particular gathering in Brussels.
If I could just add,
please, Hadi.
On that, a couple of things. So, you know, again, one at the outset, right? UNRWA is an entity. It's a rare entity in the world that has both Israeli military support and Palestinian activist support. So I mean, if you can pull that off, it's pretty impressive. There aren't that many. There are a handful of entities out there. UNRWA is one of them, and that's why I believe it deserves a continued U.S. support. But I'll say, as someone who's led the U.S. delegation to the aforementioned Ad Hoc Liaison Committee for Palestinian Development, it's actually not generally the place where the U.S. does its UNRWA work. UNRWA is done through generally a separate process. So, you know, there's that. And then lastly, I'll build on what Jake said earlier. You know, what is the future of UNRWA? What you're alluding to, which is a fact, right? Which is, as Palestinian populations continue to grow, there's going to be increasing demands. Palestinian refugee populations continue to grow. There's going to be increasing demands on UNRWA. How do we solve that problem? What's the answer? Jake told us the answer. The answer is a final status agreement, a negotiated final status agreement on the question of Israel-Palestine. That's the answer. The answer is not breaking or stressing the one entity, one of the few entities that has support from the Israeli military and support from the Palestinian street, right? That just like hurts everybody. The answer is refocusing the conversation on coming to a final status agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, whatever that is, because that agreement will have to, by definition, include the fate of Palestine refugees. So for me, that's the answer.
If I could just add, just very quickly, just one thing to that. Now, I talk to international staff across the agency often. I talk to my staff in the West Bank daily. There's not one of us that wants UNRWA to continue. All right, we all want to go home, do something else. There's plenty of conflict in the world. I can go somewhere else and find opportunities, but it has to be under the right conditions. And the right condition is a negotiated peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I would gladly be the last director of the West Bank Field Office. Be very happy to have that little feather in my hat to say that we saw this to its conclusion. There's now peace, and everybody can get on with their lives.
Okay. We have other questions, including by non-satanic people. You want to go over here?
Hi, my name is Charlie Spurtos. I'm a Middle East Studies student at GW. This question is for Ms. Campbell and for Mr. Anderson. You both mentioned that there's a different pay scale between UNRWA and the other UN organizations. Is there a statutory reason why that is? What is the difference in the pay scale? Why? You both mentioned it, so I just was curious.
Yeah. So I'm happy to answer that. So for international staff, such as Elizabeth and myself, pay scale is the same globally for any UN person. There's also one for national staff. So like if you're a U.S. citizen working for the UN here, there's a pay scale that's pegged at same for a Jordanian in Jordan and Afghani in Afghanistan and so forth. When UNRWA was created, our staff are classified as area staff. And unlike the way salaries are pegged for other UN staff, ours are pegged to the host nation as our comparator. And the forethought that was behind that, I suspect, is the hope that there will be a peace deal and that our teachers will still be needed, our doctors will still be needed. They can seamlessly integrate into the host nation mechanism without creating any great disparity in pay. So you come in more or less equal to your counterparts, and at least theoretically, it should make one of the issues of a negotiated peace process a little easier to arrive to a solution.
Okay. We have a question back in the corner.
My name is I'm a former U.S. Foreign Service officer. And I was very impressed.
Could you use the microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It would be helpful.
Yeah, name is Ken Oldroy, former Foreign Service officer in the Middle East and other places. I was very impressed while serving there, too, trying to make friends for America, at how ignorant most Americans are about the conditions on the ground in various places. In particular, I would suggest Americans are tremendously ignorant of the conditions, the deplorable conditions in Gaza. And I would suggest, what do you think about making some publicity, making them understand how tough conditions are in the largest ghetto in the world, maybe through a documentary movie? Could that be done?
With UNRWA funding.
So I didn't want to make a joke of it, but I think a lot of things have been done.
No, I didn't mean to involve you guys.
Yeah, I know 60 Minutes came in after the 2014 conflict. We did something. Anthony Bourdain was there, a bit of a different slant. There are a lot of reports. I don't know that it's quite as comprehensive as a documentary, perhaps, that you're talking about. But I think the information's out there. Sometimes you have to look for it a little bit, and it just takes a little desire to want to know. But I think there is plenty of information available, including at UNRWA's website, for example, on conditions, not just in Gaza, but in all of our fields of operation.
Okay. We have another question in the corner.
Hello, I'm Kyle Christofalo with Churches for Middle East Peace. We've been greatly dismayed by this decision of the administration and have been working also on this congressional letter to build up support. Just a very quick question for you, Ms. Campbell. You had mentioned that for the first time the funding came with geographic restrictions. I had not heard that previously. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I don't have too much to say other than the funding that we received in mid-January, the $60 million, it was earmarked for Gaza, the West Bank, and Jordan, and just for the part of our budget that basically pays the salaries of our staff.
And that was the first time.
And yeah, it's the first time, right?
So I don't recall that.
Yeah, so that type of, normally that type of funding that comes from the U.S. government is spent on all 5 fields, is intended for all 5 fields.
Can I ask a follow-up question? How has that impacted your services in Lebanon and Syria?
I mean, look, as I said in the beginning, I mean, it's really an existential crisis. I mean, I think what we're all doing right now is doing our jobs. We're trying to keep everything open, but it's, all of the donors, there's 11 donors or so who front-loaded their contributions, which we might have come otherwise later in the year. So that's helped with the sort of imminent cash flow situation. He left. But it was also of surprise, for example, to some of the colleagues in the Department of Defense about that particular earmarking. So I don't have the impression that it was something that was fully discussed within the government.
Other questions? Yes.
Michael Osta, Osgood Center. I was wondering, so there's been a lot of discussion on either, like people saying that the peace talks are either dead or really close to being dead. And has there been any thought on, like in UNRWA, about what might happen if the discussions for peace are actually dead? I mean, I don't know whether dead means like forever or for the next like 50 years or what, but I mean, has there been thought like would UNRWA just be doing the same thing over and over, or would there be any push for peace, or is there any plan? Thank you.
I mean, first, I guess I would point out we're not a political organization. Okay? We're human development and humanitarian aid. That's what we do, and we do that part quite well. And if we were political, you wouldn't have people like me up here on this panel because I would probably be working elsewhere. What it always comes back to for us, and this is a bit simplistic, is what is our mandate from the General Assembly? It's a 3-year mandate. It occurs every 3 years. Next time is 2020. It will be up for discussion by the General Assembly. And we take our direction from the General Assembly, which is made up of all the member states of the UN, on the activities they want us to implement. That's irrespective of any peace process that is either ongoing or not ongoing. To me, it's very straightforward, and it helps us focus what we're supposed to be doing on a daily basis with our staff. So it always comes back to the mandate. And I guess I would offer, as I said before, hopefully there is peace before our mandate is renewed in 2020, and everybody can get on with their lives, and we can enter the annals of history.
Jake, Hadi, did you want to add or anything about the fate of the peace process? Or,
Well, certainly there's a lot of commentary. The peace process is dead. It's on life support. All of that. And compared to the last 20 or more years that I've been working on it, it certainly there's not a lot to be said for the prospects of peace right now. But having said that, I think the other point worth making is that whatever the commentary is and whatever the arguments between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the issue doesn't go away. You still have an unresolved conflict. You still have 5 million Arabs living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean that, well, 4 million, I guess, that don't consider themselves Israeli. That issue is not going away, and it's going to have to be addressed in some way, in some form, whether through the same kind of peace process we've seen before, with the U.S. Taking the leading role, or whether some other structure, as the Palestinians are talking about. I think the issue hasn't gone away, and whether prospects are good now or not is one question, but I think in the end you're going to have to come back to this issue at some point. And the choices that the parties have are not going to change that much either. You're talking about a one-state solution, two-state solution, or a continuation of the status quo. Those are your options, and none of them are particularly ideal, but those are the choices you've got to choose from, and you can't make that. You can't really change that. Yeah, Hadi.
I think the biggest change in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship right now is sort of the fact that the U.S. is at least by the Palestinians, that the U.S. is no longer seen as a plausible broker, right? And so the Palestinian political leadership has a choice, sort of the three options that Jake alluded to, but in the long strategic sense. In the immediate sense, do they, after saying, after Trump's Jerusalem announcement and coming back and saying the U.S. has disqualified itself as a broker, do they now grovel back and say, well, we didn't really mean that. We're willing to work with the U.S.? That's a possibility. Do they seek another country as a broker or a collection of countries? Do they just exclude international parties and buckle down and just sit face to face with Israel? Or do they pursue another path, which could be criticizing Israel at the UN, civil disobedience on the ground, or abandoning the two-state solution altogether? I think those are all options may not be on the table in the immediate term in President Abbas's head, but I think ultimately, I think what President Trump has done by kind of, again, smashing Jerusalem down on the table is that he broke the table, and the parties need to figure out where they're going to go. And so are they going to remain committed to two states, or are they going to go for one state? So, I think that's where we are. We're kind of in new territory, and I want to just say it's not at the end of the day, it's not just going to be up to the Palestinian political leadership. It's going to be up to the ordinary Palestinian citizen and Israeli to sort of drive the process. And it could be that at some point, right, the majority of Palestinians, particularly those in the West Bank and Gaza, wake up one day and say, you know what, we've tried this two-state thing for 25, 30 years. It hasn't worked. Let's go for one state, civil rights, one state for all. And, I've heard so many Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza tell me, one state, two states would be great. If we can't get it, just give me an iPhone that works, give me a passport that works, and give me a vote that works. That's all I really want. I'm happy to have it in a Palestinian state. If I can't get it in a Palestinian state, I'll just get it in some state called, whatever it's called, Israel, Palestine, or whatever it is. And so that's the kind of existential question that I think the people on the ground are going to be facing in the years ahead.
If there's not any other question, let me just say I think that that your comment, Hadi, actually is the best argument that we've heard today for why the continuation of UNRWA is so important. Because indeed, if these decisions, I think you're absolutely right, if these decisions end up being dependent heavily on the attitudes of the Palestinian in the street, the extent to which UNRWA addresses the needs of people in the street and gives people confidence in the future, confidence in the support of the international community, confidence that their own needs are being addressed, that will make them that much more likely to make the right decision.
Mr. Ambassador, you definitely read between the lines. But I also want to say one thing, is when you look back at a strategic decision that the Palestinian political leadership took 30 years ago, this year, to pursue a two-state solution, because before that, it was, end the state of Israel, we want all our land back. So 30 years ago, they took the political decision to pursue a two-state solution. They entered into dialogue and discussion with the United States, as my colleagues who were in the government at the time will remember. They took that decision based on the sentiments of ordinary Palestinians in the street. The first Palestinian uprising had just started, and the Palestinian leadership, political leadership, woke up and said, our people want a practical solution this is the practical solution they want, this is what we needed, this is what we need to pursue. So they did follow the sentiment of the people on the street, and that's what, it was the Palestinian uprising, I think, that gave the Palestinian political leadership the courage to abandon the maximalist, demands of the 50s and 60s and move to a modern, practical, workable, theoretically workable solution of two states. We're now at a point 30 years later where my anecdotal evidence and the polling data that I see that the support or the belief that two states is possible is eroding among ordinary Palestinians, and because of that, we are in danger of the kind of abandonment of the two-state solution on their part, and then we're going to be left with a situation where the momentum is going to move towards some other form of accommodation between Israelis and Palestinians, and I don't think that will be something that is in that will end up in a happy solution either. We're not in a happy solution now. I also don't know that one state would be a happy solution either. But it's really ultimately going to be up to the ordinary citizens to drive this process, or elicit their political leaders to drive the process in one direction or another.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming, and please join me in thanking the panel for excellent commentary, and we'll see you all next time.